I came home 2 days early from the engineering conference in Denver, and the silence in my own house was the first thing that told me something was wrong. There was no radio playing in the kitchen, no faint murmur of the television Dorothy liked to leave on even when she wasn't watching it anymore, not since the disease had started taking pieces of her away one quiet year at a time. "Dorothy!" I called out, setting my suitcase down in the front hall. "Marisol, are you here?" Nobody answered. I checked the kitchen first, and found dishes stacked in the sink that looked at least 2 days old, a coffee cup with mold beginning to bloom along the rim. My stomach had already started to turn by the time I reached the hallway leading to our bedroom, and when I opened the door, I found my wife of 41 years sitting alone in the dark, still in the clothes I'd helped her into 3 mornings earlier before I left for the airport, the room smelling faintly of something I didn't want to name. "Jerry," she said, and her face lit up the way it still did on her good moments, the moments the disease hadn't yet managed to steal from either of us. "You're home early." "I am, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down beside her chair, my hands shaking as I checked her over, relief and fury tangling together so tightly in my chest that I could barely separate one from the other. "Where's Marisol? Where's the woman who's supposed to be looking after you?" "I don't know," Dorothy said, and something in her voice, some flicker of the sharp, capable woman she used to be before Alzheimer's began dimming the lights in her mind one room at a time, made my chest ache in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Nobody's been here in a while, Jerry. I think. I don't always know how long a while is anymore." I got her cleaned up, got her something to eat, sat with her until she'd calmed enough to nap peacefully in the recliner in the living room where I could keep an eye on her, and only then did I let myself sit down at the kitchen table and try to understand what I'd just walked into. Our son Brian had taken over managing Dorothy's care arrangements about 18 months earlier, not long after her diagnosis had progressed to the point where I could no longer safely leave her alone during my consulting trips. I still worked part-time, 3 or 4 trips a year, enough to keep my mind sharp and supplement our retirement savings, and Brian had offered, almost insistently, to handle the logistics of hiring and managing her caregivers so I could focus on my work and on simply being her husband during the time we did have together. "You shouldn't have to manage spreadsheets on top of everything else, Dad," he'd told me at the time. "Let me handle the caregiving agency, the billing, all of it. I've got the time, and honestly, it'll be good for me to feel like I'm contributing to Mom's care in a real way." I'd agreed gratefully, relieved not to have to add one more administrative burden onto the exhaustion of watching my wife slowly disappear in pieces. I'd signed the power of attorney documents for her care finances without much hesitation, trusting my son the way you trust a child you raise to be honest, and I hadn't looked closely at a single invoice from Comfort Care Associates, the agency Brian had selected, in nearly a year and a half. That silence in my own house told me, more clearly than any invoice ever could, exactly how badly that trust had been misplaced. I called the agency's main office first, expecting to hear an easy explanation, a scheduling mix-up, a substitute caregiver who'd fallen through, something mundane and forgivable. Instead, a woman named Patricia Kowalski, the agency's care coordinator, told me something that made the floor of my understanding shift beneath me entirely. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, sounding confused herself, "we haven't had an active contract for Dorothy Ashworth's care in nearly 4 months. The account was cancelled back in July. I assumed the family had transitioned to a different provider, since your son mentioned something about that when he called to close out the account." "4 months," I repeated, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "I've been paying for 24-hour professional care for 4 months. Where has that money been going?" "I can't speak to that, Mr. Ashworth," Patricia said carefully. "I can only tell you our agency hasn't provided any services to your household since early summer." I hung up the phone and sat very still at that kitchen table for a long time, listening to Dorothy's soft, even breathing from the next room, trying to understand how my wife had been left alone, not occasionally, not for an hour here or there, but apparently for months at a time, while I'd been writing checks I believed were paying for her safety. Marisol, it turned out, was not employed by Comfort Care Associates at all. When I finally reached her by phone that evening, using a number I found scrawled on an old grocery list on the refrigerator, she sounded nervous and defensive from the very first sentence. "Mr. Ashworth, I only come 3 days a week," she said. "That's what your son arranged with me. Cash, no paperwork. He said that's how you two wanted it set up, to keep things simple." 3 days a week, I said slowly. "My wife requires care every single day, Marisol. She can wander. She can leave the stove on. She needs someone with her constantly." "I told Brian that too, more than once," Marisol said, and something in her voice cracked slightly, guilt or fear or both. "He said he had it handled the other days. I needed the work, Mr. Ashworth. I'm not a licensed nurse, I want you to know that up front. I never claimed to be. I'm just someone from the neighborhood who Brian said could use some extra cash helping out. I didn't know it was supposed to be a full-time professional arrangement. I would never have agreed to something like that if I'd understood what your wife actually needed." I believed her, in the end. Marisol wasn't the person who had built this arrangement. She was simply the last, cheapest link in a chain my own son had constructed, one deception at a time, over the better part of a year and a half. I didn't call Brian that night. I sat with Dorothy instead, held her hand while she slept, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I now understood, that somewhere along the way, my son had stopped being the man managing his mother's care and had become, instead, a man managing an opportunity. I spent the following morning going through 18 months of bank statements, something I should have been doing all along. I understood now, instead of trusting a folder of invoices Brian had summarized for me every few months over dinner. What I found, once I actually sat down and traced every transaction, was a pattern that made my hands shake with a fury I hadn't felt since I was a much younger man. The care fund I'd set up, drawing from a combination of our retirement savings and a long-term care insurance policy I'd purchased years earlier specifically to protect against exactly this kind of situation, had been disbursing roughly $6,000 a month to cover Dorothy's professional care. Comfort Care Associates' actual invoices, when Patricia Kowalski emailed me copies going back 2 years, showed regular billing of just under $6,000 a month, right up until the account closed in July. But Marisol, paid in cash for 3 days a week at what she described as $15 an hour, was receiving somewhere around $700 a month. Which meant that for 4 months, over $20,000 meant for my wife's around-the-clock professional care had gone somewhere else entirely, while Dorothy had been left dangerously undersupervised in her own home. I found the answer to where that money had gone 2 days later, not through any clever detective work on my part, but because Brian, unaware I'd already discovered any of this, called to ask if I could help him out with an unexpected expense. "It's embarrassing, Dad," he said, his voice carrying the particular strained casualness of a man rehearsing a story he doesn't fully believe himself. "I got into some trouble with online sports betting a while back. I thought I had it under control, but the debt's gotten bigger than I can handle on my own right now. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious." "How much, Brian?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully level, giving nothing away yet. "About 18,000, he said. "I know that's a lot, Dad. I know I should have told you sooner instead of letting it build up like this. $18,000. Close enough to the gap I'd already calculated in Dorothy's care fund that the coincidence stopped feeling like a coincidence at all. "I need a few days to think about how I want to handle this," I told him, and I hung up before my voice could betray anything else I was feeling. I called our family attorney, a steady, thorough woman named Renata Ibarra who had handled our estate planning for nearly a decade, and I laid out everything I'd found: the cancelled care contract, the unlicensed part-time caregiver, the missing $20,000, and now, apparently, an $18,000 gambling debt my son had just confessed to almost casually over the phone. "Gerald," she said, "I want to be very direct with you. What you're describing isn't just a family disagreement about money management. If your son diverted funds specifically designated for your wife's medical care, funds he had access to under a power of attorney you granted him for exactly that purpose, that's a serious breach of fiduciary duty. Depending on how deliberately he structured it, it could also constitute financial elder abuse and insurance fraud, given that some of those funds appear to have come through a long-term care policy that requires accurate reporting of the care actually being provided." I don't want to see my son go to prison, Renata, I said. I want my wife safe, and I want to understand how deep this actually goes before I decide what to do about the rest of it. Then let's find out exactly how deep it goes, she said. Carefully, and with proper documentation, before you confront him with anything. A man capable of leaving his own mother alone in a dark room for months at a time to cover a gambling debt is not necessarily a man who's going to respond honestly to being asked politely. I called my daughter Karen that same evening, not because I suspected her of anything, but because I needed someone else in this family to know what I'd found before I confronted her brother. Karen lived 2 states away, worked as a hospital administrator, and had always had a sharper eye for financial detail than either Brian or I ever did. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished explaining everything. "Dad," she finally said, "I need to tell you something, and I should have told you months ago. Brian asked me for money back in the spring. $5,000. He said it was for some home repairs and that he'd pay me back within a few weeks. He never did, and when I brought it up again over the summer, he got defensive and changed the subject so fast I let it drop instead of pushing. I think some part of me didn't want to know what it was actually for." "None of us wanted to know," I said. "That's exactly how he got away with it for this long." "What do you need from me?" Karen asked, and I could hear, underneath the shock, the same steady resolve I remembered from her as a little girl, the one who always insisted on checking her own math homework twice even when the teacher said once was enough. "I need you to help me understand the full picture before I say anything to him directly," I said. "Renata thinks there might be an insurance fraud component here too, if he was submitting claims for care that wasn't actually happening. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with before this turns into a conversation I can't take back." Karen flew in 3 days later, and the two of us spent an entire weekend going through every document we could find, cross-referencing bank statements against the long-term care insurance claims Renata had requested copies of. What we found was worse than either of us had expected. Brian hadn't simply diverted the difference between what he was collecting from me and what he was actually paying Marisol. He'd also continued submitting monthly claims to the long-term care insurance company using Comfort Care Associates' letterhead and billing codes, months after the actual contract with the agency had been cancelled. The claims described 24-hour licensed nursing care that, according to Patricia Kowalski's own records, had simply stopped being provided. "This isn't just taking money that was already yours, Dad," Karen said, staring at the stack of falsified claims spread across my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once believed my son was simply helping manage his mother's care. "This is insurance fraud. Federal insurance fraud, if I'm reading this correctly. He forged an agency's billing information to keep collecting payouts for care that stopped happening months ago. Why would he even need to keep the claims going, if he'd already stopped paying for the actual care?" I asked, still struggling to hold the full shape of what my son had built. "Because the insurance payouts were probably funding a chunk of what he was using to cover his gambling losses," Karen said quietly. "If the claims stopped, the payouts would stop too, and he'd have had to explain to you directly why the care fund suddenly needed less money each month. Keeping the fraudulent claims running kept the whole thing invisible. As long as the checks kept flowing in roughly the same amount they always had, you'd never have a reason to look closer." I sat with that understanding for a long time, watching my daughter's careful, methodical anger fill the same kitchen where, decades earlier, I'd taught both my children to play checkers on rainy afternoons. I thought about every month I'd looked at that consistent, unremarkable line item in our finances and felt reassured, rather than suspicious, precisely because Brian had been careful enough to make sure nothing ever looked different, month over month, even as the actual care behind those numbers had quietly disappeared entirely. Installing the small camera in the living room, the one that would end up giving us our clearest evidence of all, was Karen's idea. "If he's still telling Marisol to come 3 days a week and telling you everything's handled the rest of the time, we need proof of what an ordinary week actually looks like for Mom," she said. "Not for a lawsuit necessarily. For you, Dad. So you know exactly what's been happening while you're at work or traveling." We installed it discreetly, angled toward the living room where Dorothy spent most of her days, and over the following 2 weeks, it recorded exactly what I'd feared it would, long stretches of silence, Dorothy wandering the house alone, confused and occasionally frightened, calling out names that sometimes weren't even ours, with no one arriving to comfort or redirect her until Marisol scheduled 3-day visits, and even then, only for a few hours at a time. Watching those recordings back, late one night after Karen had gone to bed, I wept in a way I hadn't allowed myself to since Dorothy's diagnosis first arrived 4 years earlier. Not just for what my wife had endured, though that alone would have been more than enough. I wept for the version of my son I'd believed in for 36 years, the boy who used to bring his mother dandelions from the backyard because he thought they were prettier than roses, now revealed as a man capable of leaving that same woman alone in the dark to protect a debt he was too ashamed to admit to honestly. Renata helped us arrange a meeting with an investigator from the insurance company's Special Investigations Unit, a measured, unhurried man named Douglas Petrakis who had clearly seen more cases like ours than I wanted to imagine existed. He reviewed the falsified claims, the actual invoices from Comfort Care Associates, and the timeline Karen and I had assembled, nodding slowly as the picture came together in front of him. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, "I want to be honest with you about how this typically unfolds. The company will almost certainly open a formal fraud investigation, given the clear discrepancy between the billed care and the actual services rendered. Depending on the total amount fraudulently claimed, which based on what you've shown me could exceed the federal threshold for insurance fraud charges, this could move beyond a civil matter and into criminal territory, handled by the district attorney's office rather than simply our claims department." "What happens to the payout itself?" I asked. "The money that's already gone out, based on those false claims?" "Typically, the company will seek full recovery of any funds paid out under fraudulent claims," Douglas said. "In practice, that usually means either your son personally repays what was fraudulently obtained, or the company pursues a judgment against him directly. Given the family relationship, and given that you're the actual policyholder who suffered the harm here rather than a third party, you'll have some influence over how aggressively we pursue the criminal side of this, though the fraud itself is a matter between our company and your son regardless of what you decide about that." I thought about that conversation for days afterward, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you're not sure you want to look underneath. I didn't want my son in prison. But I also understood, with a clarity that frightened me, that if I simply absorbed this quietly, the way families sometimes do to protect their own image of themselves, Brian would learn nothing except that his mother's safety could be treated as an acceptable cost of covering his own mistakes. I called Brian and asked him to come to the house alone, without his wife, on a Saturday afternoon. Karen stayed in the next room, close enough to hear everything, close enough for Dorothy to know she wasn't alone in the house either, safely occupied with a puzzle at the kitchen table while her son and I finally had the conversation I'd been building toward for nearly 3 weeks. "Dad," Brian said, settling into the chair across from me with the easy, practiced casualness he'd clearly rehearsed on the drive over, "I know I still owe you an answer about the money I mentioned. I've been meaning to sit down and really talk it through with you properly." "I already know everything, Brian," I said, and I watched the practiced ease drain slowly out of his face as I laid it out for him, piece by piece, the cancelled contract with Comfort Care Associates, Marisol's cash arrangement, the falsified insurance claims, the video from the living room camera showing his mother alone for hours at a stretch, disoriented and afraid, while he collected checks for care that had stopped happening months earlier. "Dad, I can explain," he started. "I don't want an explanation right now, Brian," I said, keeping my voice level, though every part of me wanted to shout the way I hadn't shouted at my son since he was a teenager sneaking back into the house past curfew. "I want you to understand what I actually watched on that recording. Your mother, calling out for me in an empty house, for hours, alone, while you were telling both of us that everything was handled. I want you to sit with that before either of us says another word about explanations." He put his face in his hands, and for a long moment, the only sound in that kitchen was Dorothy humming quietly to herself over her puzzle in the next room, unaware of the reckoning happening just beyond the doorway. "I never meant for it to get this far," Brian finally said, his voice thick. "I told myself Marisol had it handled. I told myself I'd catch up on the payments once I won back what I'd lost. I kept thinking one good week would fix everything, and then I'd never have to tell either of you any of it happened at all. I know that's not an excuse, Dad. I know there isn't an excuse big enough for what I let happen to Mom. No, I said. There isn't. Karen came into the kitchen then, unable to stay quiet in the next room any longer. How long has the gambling actually been going on, Brian? She asked. Because $18,000 doesn't happen in a few unlucky weeks. That's a habit, not a mistake. Brian was quiet for a long moment before he answered. About 3 years, he said. It started small. Football pools with guys from work, nothing that felt serious. Then it was an app on my phone, and it just kept feeling like the next bet was the one that would fix everything the last one broke. By the time Mom's diagnosis got worse and Dad asked me to take over her care finances, I already owed more than I could admit to anyone. I told myself I was just borrowing against the account temporarily. I told myself I'd pay it all back before either of you ever needed to know. You didn't borrow from an account, Brian, I said. You borrowed against your mother's safety. Those aren't the same thing, no matter how you've been telling yourself the story. He nodded, not arguing, his shoulders sagging under the weight of finally having the whole truth sitting exposed on the table between us instead of buried under months of careful management. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now, I said, you're going to enter a treatment program for the gambling, a real one, with accountability built into it, not just a promise you make to yourself in the car on the way home. You're going to work out a formal repayment plan with Renata for every dollar that was taken from your mother's care fund, and separately, for whatever the insurance company determines was fraudulently claimed. And you are never again, for as long as I'm alive, going to have access to any account connected to your mother's care or safety. That part isn't a punishment, Brian. That part is simply the truth of what trust means once it's been broken this deeply. It doesn't come back all at once, and it doesn't come back unconditionally. And the insurance fraud? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you going to press charges? I thought about Douglas Petrakis's careful, measured explanation of how these cases typically unfolded, about the choice sitting in front of me between protecting my son from the full legal consequences of what he'd done and making sure he understood, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how serious this had been. I'm not going to actively push for criminal charges, as long as you cooperate completely with the insurance company's investigation and repay every dollar according to whatever schedule Renata and Douglas agree is fair, I said. But I want to be very clear with you, Brian. That decision isn't mercy because I think what you did was small. It's mercy because I still believe, somewhere underneath everything you've shown me these past 18 months, there's a chance for you to become a man your mother would recognize again. I'm choosing to bet on that chance. I hope, for both our sakes, that it's a bet I don't come to regret. Brian entered a residential treatment program for gambling addiction the following week, the kind with structured accountability, family counseling sessions, and a caseworker who called weekly to check in on his progress and, just as importantly, on ours. Karen and I hired a new caregiving agency immediately, one Renata personally vetted, with licensed staff, daily check-in reports, and a level of oversight I should have insisted on from the very beginning, 18 months earlier, instead of quietly stepping back and trusting a folder of invoices I never once thought to question. The insurance investigation concluded roughly 10 weeks later. Douglas Petrakis's team determined that just over $31,000 had been fraudulently claimed over the 4 months since the Real Care contract had lapsed, a larger figure than Karen and I had initially calculated, once penalties and administrative fees were factored in. Because Brian cooperated fully, provided a complete written account of what he'd done, and entered treatment before any formal charges were filed, the district attorney's office ultimately agreed to a deferred prosecution arrangement, full restitution, ongoing court-monitored treatment compliance, and a probationary period during which any further violation would reinstate the original fraud charges immediately. It's a second chance most people in his position don't get, Renata told me, reviewing the final terms with Karen and me in her office. I want you to understand that clearly, Gerald. The fact that he's facing consequences that allow for rebuilding rather than simply punishment is, in large part, because of how thoroughly and honestly you documented everything before confronting him, and because of how completely he cooperated once you did. Neither of those things happens by accident. Dorothy's transition back to proper, licensed 24-hour care happened almost immediately, and the change in her, within just a few short weeks, was more dramatic than I'd allowed myself to hope for. She was eating regularly again, sleeping through the night instead of wandering in confusion, and though the disease itself hadn't reversed, of course, and never would, the fear that had crept into her eyes during those months of neglect began, slowly, to soften back into something closer to the calm trust one remembered from before any of this had happened. "You came home," she told me one evening, several weeks into the new care arrangement, reaching for my hand the way she used to before the disease made reaching for anything at all feel uncertain to her. "I remember that. You came home and everything got better." "I did, sweetheart," I said, my throat tight. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand how much better it needed to get." Brian's road through treatment wasn't smooth, and I won't pretend it was, for the sake of a tidier story than the one we actually lived through. There was a difficult stretch, about 2 months in, when his caseworker called to tell me he'd missed 2 consecutive counseling sessions and seemed to be pulling back from the accountability structure that was supposed to be holding him steady. I drove out to see him that same weekend, and found a man who looked more exhausted and more frightened than I'd ever seen him, even in the kitchen the day I first confronted him with everything I knew. "I keep thinking about that video, Dad," he told me, sitting across from me in the treatment facility's small visiting room. "Mom, alone, calling out for someone who wasn't there. I can't stop seeing it. Some days it makes me want to fight harder in this program. Other days it just makes me want to disappear so I don't have to keep being the person who let that happen. Disappearing isn't an option I'm willing to accept from you," I told him, as firmly as I'd said anything to him since this whole ordeal began. "Not because I'm not still angry, Brian. I am. I imagine some part of me will stay angry about this for a long time yet. But your mother is going to need you in her life for whatever years she has left, and your own children are going to need a father who faced this instead of one who let the shame of it swallow him whole. Fight harder because of what that video showed you, not despite it. Let it be the thing that keeps you honest instead of the thing that finally breaks you." He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, and he returned to his sessions the following week, more consistently after that, according to the caseworker's regular reports. Brian's children, my grandchildren, were 9 and 12 at the time, old enough to notice their father's extended absence but young enough that Karen and I agonized over how much of the truth they actually needed to carry. In the end, we settled on something honest but gentle, told to them together, with Brian's wife Melissa present and Brian himself joining by video call from the treatment facility to speak with them directly. "Your dad made some serious mistakes handling money that was supposed to help take care of Grandma," I told them, sitting with both kids in my living room, the same living room where the small camera had once recorded their grandmother's frightened, lonely afternoons. "He's working really hard right now to fix those mistakes and to make sure he never makes them again. That's why he's been away. It's not because he doesn't love you. It's because loving you means he needs to become someone healthier before he comes all the way back home." My granddaughter, the 12-year-old, was quiet for a long moment before she asked the question I'd been half expecting since we sat down. "Is Grandma going to be okay? Was it really bad, the stuff that happened to her?" "Grandma is doing much better now," I told her honestly. "She has wonderful people taking care of her every single day, and I make sure of that myself now, all the time, not just checking in every few months. It was scary for a while, sweetheart. I won't pretend it wasn't. But we caught it, and we fixed it, and your grandmother is safe now. That's what matters most." Melissa, for her part, had known nothing about the gambling or the diverted funds before I confronted Brian that Saturday afternoon, and the discovery had nearly ended their marriage entirely. She stayed, in the end, though it took months of her own counseling alongside Brian's treatment before she felt any real confidence that the man she'd married hadn't disappeared completely underneath the choices he'd made. "I keep asking myself how I didn't see it," she told me once, months later, over coffee at my kitchen table while Brian was at an evening session. The late nights on his phone, the way he'd get defensive about any conversation involving money. "I saw pieces of it, Gerald. I just didn't want to put them together into something that big. None of us wanted to put the pieces together, I told her. I had 18 months of consistent invoices sitting in my own files and never once thought to actually verify them against the agency directly. We all trusted the version of the story that let us keep living our lives without having to face something this frightening. I don't think that makes any of us foolish, Melissa. I think it just makes us human, in a way I've had to learn to forgive myself for too, alongside forgiving him. A full year passed before Brian completed the formal terms of his treatment program and his court-monitored probation simultaneously, a year that tested every part of our family in ways I never could have anticipated the night I walked into that dark, silent house after coming home early from Denver. He completed his restitution payments to the insurance company in full, working a second job on weekends for nearly the entire year to make it happen faster than the original schedule required, something Renata told me she rarely saw defendants in his situation actually manage to do. I gave him back limited financial responsibilities slowly, and only after months of consistent, verified honesty, first small things, running errands for his mother's care team, then eventually, cautiously, being trusted again with modest financial tasks that I personally reviewed alongside him rather than simply handing over and stepping away, the way I had the first time. Trust, I'd learned the hard way, wasn't something you could simply reinstate with a single conversation, no matter how sincere the apology attached to it. It was something you rebuilt the same slow way you'd lost it, one verified, transparent decision at a time. Dorothy's disease continued its slow, unstoppable progression over that year, the way we both knew it eventually would, regardless of anything else happening around her. But she spent that year properly cared for, safely supervised, surrounded by people who showed up when they said they would, and I've come to understand that this, in the end, was the piece of all of it that mattered most to me. I couldn't stop the disease taking my wife from me one memory at a time. But I could make absolutely certain that whatever time remained to her happened in safety, surrounded by honesty, rather than hidden behind falsified paperwork and a silence I'd nearly mistaken for peace. Karen and I grew closer through that year too, in ways I hadn't expected. She started flying in more often, not just for crises but for ordinary weekends, sitting with her mother on good afternoons, helping me manage the practical realities of Dorothy's care with the same careful, methodical attention she'd brought to uncovering what Brian had done in the first place. I keep thinking about how close we came to never finding out, she told me once, watching her mother nap peacefully in the recliner on a quiet Sunday afternoon. If you hadn't come home early that week, Dad. If that conference hadn't ended a couple of days sooner than planned. How long would it have gone on? I try not to spend too much time imagining that version of things, I told her honestly. I try to just be grateful for the version where I did come home, where the silence in that house was loud enough to make me start asking questions instead of assuming everything was fine simply because it always had been before. On the day Brian officially completed his treatment program and probation requirements, our whole family gathered at the house for a quiet dinner, nothing elaborate, just the people who had carried each other through that difficult year finally sitting together at the same table without the weight of an unresolved reckoning hanging over every conversation. Brian stood up partway through the meal, the way people do when they've been carrying something they need to finally say out loud. I don't have a speech prepared, he said, his voice a little unsteady. I just want to say, in front of everyone, that I understand what I almost cost this family, and I understand that understanding it doesn't undo it. Mom, I am so sorry for every hour you spent alone and scared in a house that was supposed to be the safest place in the world for you. Dad, I'm sorry I made you the one who had to catch me instead of the one I trusted enough to come to honestly, before it ever got this far. Karen, thank you for not looking away, even when it would have been easier for all of us if you had. I don't expect any of you to simply forget what happened. I just want you to know that every day of this past year, I've tried to become someone worth trusting again, one day at a time. Dorothy, in one of her clearer moments, reached over and took her son's hand. You came home too, she said simply, echoing, without quite knowing it, the same words she'd once said to me the evening I'd returned to find her frightened and alone. That's what matters, Brian. You came home. I watched my son's composure finally break completely at his mother's simple, undeserved grace, and I found myself understanding something I hadn't fully appreciated until that exact moment, that Dorothy's illness, for all it had taken from her, had never touched the fundamental generosity of her heart, the same generosity that had first drawn me to her more than 4 decades earlier, still intact somewhere beneath all the memories the disease had slowly carried away. I think often, now, about the version of myself who used to sign off on invoices without verifying them, who trusted a folder of numbers simply because they arrived consistently, month after month, from a son I loved and had no reason, on the surface, to doubt. I don't carry guilt over that trust exactly, not anymore, though I did for a long while in the early months of untangling everything Brian had built. I've come to understand that trust isn't the mistake in a situation like this one. The mistake is trust without any verification at all, especially when the person you love most and the person managing their care happen to be different people, and especially when the stakes of getting it wrong are as high as they were for Dorothy. If there's one thing I would tell another father sitting where I once sat, handing off the details of a spouse's care to an adult child because the exhaustion of managing it all alone has simply become too much to carry, it would be this: love your children enough to trust them, but love the person depending on that care enough to verify it anyway. Call the agency directly, every few months, not because you expect to find deception, but because the people who most need protecting are rarely in a position to tell you themselves when something has gone wrong. Dorothy couldn't call me from that dark, silent house to tell me she was frightened and alone. She could only sit there, waiting, hoping someone would eventually come home and notice. I noticed, eventually. 2 days earlier than expected, walking into a silence that turned out to be carrying an entire hidden year and a half inside of it. I think about how differently this story might have ended if that conference in Denver had run its full scheduled length, if I'd walked through that door on time instead of early, if the silence in my own house had simply continued a little longer before anyone finally thought to question it. Dorothy is still with me now, nearly 2 years after that day, her disease continuing its slow, familiar progression, some days better than others, the way it's always been since her diagnosis first arrived. But she is safe every single one of those days, properly cared for, surrounded by people who show up exactly when they say they will, and by a family that finally learned, the hard way, that love without vigilance can leave even the people we cherish most sitting alone in the dark, waiting for someone to come home. Brian visits every week now, sometimes with the grandchildren, sometimes alone, always accountable, always transparent about whatever small financial task I've allowed him to help with again, each one still reviewed together rather than simply handed over the way I once, foolishly, handed over everything at once. Our relationship isn't what it was before any of this happened, and I've made a kind of peace with that. It's become something else instead, more careful, more honest, built on verified trust rather than assumed trust, which I've come to believe, after everything my family has walked through together, is actually the sturdier foundation of the two. I still sit with Dorothy most evenings in that same living room where the small camera once captured her loneliest, most frightened hours. These days, it captures something else entirely, her humming quietly over a puzzle, Brian's kids doing their homework at the coffee table on visiting weekends, the ordinary, unremarkable safety of a family that came apart at its foundation and found its way, slowly and imperfectly, back toward something worth calling whole again. I came home early from Denver almost 2 years ago now, expecting nothing more complicated than a quiet Tuesday evening with my wife. What I found instead changed the shape of my family completely, cracked something open that had been quietly rotting beneath the surface for far longer than I ever wanted to believe possible. I am grateful, more than I know how to properly say, that I came home in time to notice. Marisol testified to the insurance investigators as well, once Douglas Petrakis's team reached out to her directly, and her account, when I finally read the transcript months later, confirmed everything I'd already come to believe about her role in what had happened. She hadn't known she was standing in for a full professional care team. She genuinely believed, based on what Brian had told her, that she was providing supplemental help alongside other arrangements he'd already made. "I want you to know," she told me, the last time we spoke by phone, months after everything had been resolved, "that I think about your wife often. I should have asked more questions when the schedule never seemed to add up to what she actually needed. I'm sorry I didn't push harder, Mr. Ashworth. I got comfortable not asking, because the answers Brian gave me were always just believable enough to accept. "You weren't the one who built this, Marisol," I told her. "You did the best you could with the information you were given, and you told me the truth the moment I finally asked the right questions. That matters more than you probably realize." Renata helped me restructure Dorothy's entire care and financial arrangement in the months that followed, building in exactly the kind of verification and oversight I wished I'd insisted on from the very beginning. A dedicated care trust now, separate entirely from any family member's direct access, dispersing payments only upon confirmed, documented delivery of services, with quarterly reports sent automatically not just to me but to Karen as well, so that no single family member would ever again be the sole gatekeeper standing between Dorothy's needs and the resources meant to meet them. This is the kind of structure I wish more families built proactively, before something like this ever happens, Renata told me, reviewing the final documents together in her office. Most people don't think to build in this level of transparency until they've already learned, the hard way, exactly how much can go wrong without it. "I'm sorry you had to learn it this way, Gerald. But I'm glad you're building something this thorough now, for whatever time Dorothy has left, and frankly, for your own protection too, as you continue getting older yourself." I think about that conversation often, about how much of what happened to my family might have been prevented entirely by a little more structural transparency built in from the start, rather than the informal trust I'd extended to my son simply because he was my son, and because extending anything less had felt, at the time, like an insult to a relationship I never imagined could bend this far under pressure. I don't offer that reflection as a way of excusing what Brian did. He made his own choices, deliberately and repeatedly, over a year and a half of careful concealment, and he alone carries the responsibility for the harm those choices caused his mother. But I've also come to understand that families rarely fail all at once, in one dramatic moment of betrayal. They fail slowly, in small unquestioned assumptions, in trust extended without verification, in love that mistakes the absence of obvious problems for the actual presence of safety. I extended exactly that kind of unquestioned trust for 18 months, and my wife paid the price for every month of it, alone in a house that should have been the safest place she had left in a world the disease was slowly narrowing around her. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with understanding you nearly lost something twice, once to a disease with no cure, and once to a betrayal that could have been prevented with nothing more complicated than a single phone call to verify an invoice. I carry both of those griefs now, alongside the deep, complicated gratitude of a family that found its way back from the second one, even as we continue walking, together, through everything the first one still has left to take from us. Dorothy doesn't remember most of what happened during those difficult months anymore, and in my more honest moments, I've come to feel a strange kind of relief about that particular mercy of her disease. She doesn't carry the fear of those long, silent afternoons the way the rest of us do. She only knows, in whatever way her illness still allows her to know anything clearly, that her family shows up now, consistently, every single day, exactly the way a family is supposed to. That, in the end, is the only version of this story I really want her to remember, even if the rest of us will carry the fuller truth of it for the remainder of our lives. She is safe. She is loved. And every single evening, without fail, someone comes home. Some nights, after Dorothy has gone to sleep, I sit alone in that living room and think back to the exact moment I opened our bedroom door and found her sitting there in the dark, still in the same clothes I'd helped her into 3 mornings earlier. I think about how easily that moment could have gone differently, a delayed flight that kept me in Denver the full scheduled length of the conference, a decision to call Brian instead of walking through the front door myself, any one of a dozen small choices that might have let the silence in that house continue undisturbed for weeks or months longer than it already had. I don't know that I did anything especially brave, coming home early and asking questions I probably should have been asking all along. I only know that I finally asked them, and that asking them, however late, made all the difference between the family we might have lost entirely and the imperfect, rebuilding family we have now. I've stopped needing the story to be more dramatic than that simple truth. Sometimes the bravest thing a father can do is walk through his own front door, notice that something feels wrong, and refuse to let the silence explain itself away. That, I think, is the piece of this story I most want any other father or husband to carry with them, more than the specific details of falsified invoices or unlicensed caregivers or a son's hidden gambling debt. Vigilance is not the opposite of love. It is one of its most necessary forms, especially for the people among us who can no longer advocate loudly for themselves. I loved my wife every single day of those 18 months I now understand to have been dangerous ones for her. But love alone, without the discipline of actually checking, actually verifying, actually walking through the front door and asking hard questions when something felt even slightly off, was never going to be enough to keep her safe on its own. I know that now. I wish I had known it sooner. But I am, at least, deeply grateful I finally learned it in time.